isn't as big as a big city, but we still have fun.
It's peaceful, and I like a lot of trees and stuff. There's lots of people you can go down the street and play with.
The park's the fun. It's just fun.
People get along, and there's not much hate and stuff around. Just a nice community.
What qualities make up a good community? Is it the homes that people live in? The availability of steady employment? The care it shows for its children? If you could build a community from scratch that sought those qualities, what would it look like? For one Illinois town, it's not a hard question. They just have to look at a neighborhood that was actually created specifically to provide the ideal conditions needed for a successful community. The village that was founded here was designed from the outset to provide available jobs, comfortable housing, educational opportunities, and cultural enrichment. And its founder hoped to use it as a model for better industrial relations as well. After well over a century, that community is still a pleasant place to live and raise a family, showing the strength of the founder's vision. It survives today as an example of one of the most successful attempts at cooperative living in America. At the end of the 19th century, there were bitter struggles between management and labor. Strikes broke out across the nation. Commerce was halted. Individual workers had little power, and they were forced to live and work under terrible and unsafe conditions. These conditions led to many demands for change, but the conflict intensified, and it seemed unlikely that the struggle could be resolved. There were not many businessmen who could sympathize with the plight of their employees, but in 1886, the wealthy owner of a wholesale plumbing business took a daring step. He offered to share the profits of his company with his workers. This enterprising individual, a Norwegian immigrant named Nels O. Nelson, had a radical idea: that labor unrest could be eliminated by giving workers a stake in the company, pleasant working conditions, and decent housing. Nelson had been born in Lillesand, Norway on September 11, 1844. His family came to the U.S. in 1846 and first settled in St. Joseph, Missouri. After serving in the Union Army during the Civil War, Nelson moved to St. Louis in 1872. The young Norwegian showed a talent for business, and within a few years he owned his own plumbing supply company. But he also had a social conscience. He was well-read and familiar with the various new economic ideas being considered at the time. Unlike other industrialists at the time, Ino Nelson did not consider making money his highest priority. He was a philanthropist for all of his adult life and used some of his wealth to make lives better for the less fortunate. In 1886, a bitter railroad strike affected many industries, including Nelson's. During the negotiations, he recoiled from the selfish behavior of company owners and decried their brutality against striking workers. Instead of blaming the workers for the problems, Nelson began studying the reasons for the conflict and began to form his own ideas about how to improve labor relations. He came to believe that cooperation was the key to minimizing employee unrest. That year, he became one of the first employers in America to introduce profit sharing to his employees.
The working men in the United States were attempting to organize. Plus, there had been labor unrest in other places. The working men were trying to get it down to a 9-hour day. There were still problems with child labor and women working in factories. He saw this sort of thing, and he had a social conscience, but he also was a very practical man. He viewed that strikes were really neither to the benefit of the strikers nor to the benefit of the capitalist, that everybody lost on this, and that there must be some better way of approaching the resolution of the conflict between labor and capital.
By the 1880s, St. Louis had become a crowded, dirty, unhealthy place to live and work. Since his business was thriving and needed to expand, Nelson began considering moving his company out of the city. Nelson's goal from the very beginning was to create not just a new factory, but a prosperous community which would offer ideal conditions to all who lived there. He became determined to create such a working environment that would put his newly developed theories to the test. In 1890, he got his chance. After searching the area, he found a suitable location just south of the town of Edwardsville across the river in Illinois. Recognizing the economic potential of this new industry, local citizens and businesses donated to a fund which originally raised over $20,000. The money was used to purchase 125 acres of land for the project. The site was generally level and was close to the railroad lines, coal mines, and fresh water. On May 12, 1890, ground was broken for the first buildings, and the new model community was born. Nelson's philosophy was based on the belief that workers needed only a good home and a decent paying job to achieve a happy life. He studied the writing of many of the social thinkers of his day and explored a variety of economic concepts.
Ultimately, in the Leclaire company, the idea was that the working men would actually own the company as the result of rolling over the profits back into the company.
I would say offhand he's the first profit sharer in the United States. He gave away his stock to his employees. He was a socialist. He was a philanthropist, no doubt about it. He was a socialist, but not the socialist that we're thinking of. But Leclaire, grandfather's dream, came true with his manufacturing village.
The new community was to be a model industrial village where his employees could live in an atmosphere of harmony and cooperation. It was named after the French pioneer of profit sharing, Edmond Jean Leclaire, though some locals thought it should be called South Edwardsville. It was based on the principles that Nelson thought were the most important for any successful community: freedom, education, work, homes, recreation, and beauty. Nelson's experiment turned out to be one of the nation's most successful attempts at cooperative living. The company which he founded grew into one of the largest of its kind in the country, and the nearby village of Leclaire is still a prosperous and pleasant place to live. The success of these two endeavors is a tribute to its founder, N. O. Nelson. Home life for working families in the 1890s was crowded, unsanitary, and squalid. The crowded tenements of the industrial towns violated every rule for plumbing, drainage, ventilation, and public health. Nelson observed these conditions and believed that much of the problems of working people were caused by their lack of property. Being forced to live in rented tenements and often shop in company stores left them powerless in labor negotiations. Central to his plan was his belief that individual home ownership was the best type of living arrangement. He therefore set out to make it possible for anyone to purchase their own home. A lot could be bought for as little as $350. A buyer could put $3 down as a cash down payment and pay off the loan at a rate of $2 a week. There was no interest on the loans and no taxes for the first 3 years. The Nelson Company had plans for over 100 houses, which it could build for a minimum profit. The payment schedule was based on the buyer's income, and most mortgages could be paid off in 10 to 15 years. The company provided water, fire protection, and electricity at reasonable rates, and most homes had a bathroom. The residential area of Leclaire was designed and laid out by Julius Pitzman, the same architect who had laid out Forest Park in St. Louis. He stipulated a uniform setback for the houses and put in several curved streets. The homes themselves were relatively small but comfortable frame houses. Even Nelson's home, while larger than most, was plain and lacked the ornamentation normally found in Victorian architecture. New residents found that there were many advantages to living in Leclaire. Residents could keep livestock and could grow their own fruit and vegetables. But they still lived close to their work. This gave the advantages of the city with the freedom and economy of country life. Although the first streets were unpaved, Edwardsville was well served by rail transportation, and over 100 electric and passenger trains entered the city every day. Because of these factors, there was a big demand for Leclaire property, and new additions had to be made to the original village. In 1905, over 150 lots were sold in only 2 days. Only 7 buyers failed to pay in full for the property. The company's generous terms meant that no homeowner ever lost their property or lost money by investing in the community. Nelson bragged that there had never been a mortgage foreclosure, delinquent tax sale, or even an eviction for non-payment of rent. By applying his progressive ideas to his model town, he had created a unique situation. Leclaire had more houses owned by its residents in proportion to its size than any other city in America. One of those early homeowners who still lived in the same house was Walter Abendroth, a carpenter who moved there with his family during those early years.
Yeah, I moved up here in 1920. I come over here in 1919, and I worked for Nelson's up here. I passed this house every morning and every night, and you know that house took my eye. And one day I seen somebody standing out in front of that house over there, and I come across the street and I says to him, I says, "Mister, hi." I says, "Do you know who owns this house here?" He says, "Why?" I says, "Well," I says, "I'd like to buy a house." He says to me, "Why?" He says, "You never even seen the inside." I says, "I don't have to see the inside." I says, "I can tell you just exactly what you've got in that house." He wanted to know what. I says, "You got a bedroom and a bathroom and a living room on the north side." I says, "You got a kitchen and a front or a dining room on the other side. And then you got a hall going from the bedroom into the front room into the bathroom." He says, "How'd you know all that?" I says, "Well," I says, "if you'd build as many houses as I helped build in my days," I says, "I can just about tell you how a house looks on the inside by looking at it on the outside." That was it. So I bought the place.
By the end of the 19th century, the Industrial Revolution had permanently changed the lives of American workers. Concentrated mostly in the cities, they were forced to endure low wages, poor working conditions, and substandard housing. Workers found that their employers cared little about their safety and often required them to work under hazardous conditions. Nelson believed that the central feature of rational life was a person's work, and he placed a great importance on the environment in which workers performed their jobs. His new factory at Leclaire was therefore designed to provide excellent working conditions for the employees. The single-story brick buildings had skylights and large arched windows which provided plenty of sunlight and fresh air. They all contained electric lighting and a sprinkler system in case of fire. Ivy covered many of the buildings, and flower beds were located around them. Each building housed a separate manufacturing section. The complex included a cabinet shop, a brass foundry, a marble yard, and a machine shop. The chief products of the company were pipe threading machines, bathtubs, marble and onyx sinks, toilet seats, fireplace mantles, plumber's brasswork, and cabinets. Near the factory was the cooperative store. Memberships could be purchased for $50 a share. Goods were sold at the average market price, but members received a 6% dividend at the end of the year on their investment, and an additional dividend proportional to their trade at the store. Workers were paid the regular union scales for their labor, but since they received dividends from their stock and had lower living expenses, they were much better off than the average workman of the time. While every employee was expected to do his or her job, there was no need for a boss to constantly prod them on. Since they were all profit sharers and the company had an interest in its success, they were motivated to carry out their work with a minimum of supervision. Considering these factors, the Leclaire workers found their employment to be as ideal as Nelson had hoped.
But they seemed like they were a close-knit group. 20 minutes to 7, the whistle would blow and they would head for the plant. Noon it would blow again, they'd come home for dinner. 20 minutes to 1, they'd go back again. The whistle blew each time. And then 4 o'clock, why, the whistle blew for the last time and they went home. Which to me seemed like a nice working condition. Especially in those times. It was some tough times back in the late 20s, early 30s.
One of the first Nelson employees to move to Leclaire was William Shaw, who managed the pipe threading division for 52 years.
My parents were living in St. Louis. I was a baby. And the reason that my father came out from St. Louis was because N.O. Nelson found him to be such a dependable, a sturdy, reliable man, young man, and he wanted him to take charge of the factory and help in other ways. And we had a very cute little cottage that was across from the kindergarten at the back on Hale Avenue, and that's where we were. And all the activities in Leclaire took place at the schoolhouse. We younger children all went there to the school until we were ready to go into the third grade. Then we would go down to Edwardsville.
N.O. Nelson was a strong advocate of free education for everyone. One of the first buildings constructed in Leclaire was the Academy, which contained a library and 4 classrooms divided by sliding walls. The educational program originally offered a kindergarten, grade school, job training, and adult classes. The first superintendent was Olive Thomas, but when she retired, a replacement was needed.
Well, see, I lived there in Leclaire, and I took part in all the activities that came up or whatever. And strange to say, the people liked me very much. And I guess I felt at home with everyone. And I would go around the different places where they had children, and I would associate with all the children. And I think that was something that impressed the people, although I was not conscious of it. You know, I just liked to do that. That was my nature. And so I just knew everybody out in Leclaire and was friends with everyone. After I graduated from high school in Edwardsville, 1914, I stayed home for a few years, wondering just what I would like to do or want to do. And then there came an opening there at the kindergarten. And so I applied for assistant to the teacher. And so that got me started. And I taught there. I was there, I guess, 20 years. And I just loved every minute of it. And I loved the work and all. And when the teacher that was in charge left, got married and left, why then I did not apply for her position. It never occurred to me to do it. I was the assistant, and I guess I was, I don't know, I was happy. But the people of Leclaire demanded, sounds so funny, that I be put in charge. And they said that I had taught there so many years and got along so well with the children, and everything was so wonderful, and that was what they wanted. So all in all, I spent 20 years there, and when I left, it was because I got married and came out here. And that really, after that, they didn't have any much going on there at the schoolhouse anymore.
I was born and raised here in Edwardsville, and I'm proud to say that I'm a graduate of the Academy down here, and I enjoy very much coming back, meeting old friends, and help celebrating this event. You know, it's surprising. I can remember a lot of things we did in the playground outside. I can't remember too much of the curriculum or whatever it was. Miss Mildred Shaw was the superintendent at that time, and I graduated in the class of 1931. And one of the big events was to have the maypole dance, and we all dressed up. Our mothers made the clothes. We had a great time.
Life for children in the cities was often harsh, unhealthy, and miserable. Many children were forced to spend long hours in the factories so that their families could earn enough to survive. Others were forced to work in the home, helping to make extra income for the family. Their playgrounds were the alleyways and the streets of the tenements. In Leclaire, however, a child's life was totally different. Away from the crime and grime of the urban scene, they were free to develop their talents and enjoy the special pleasures of childhood. In between the residential area and the industrial plant was a 2.5-acre campus with baseball and football fields, a tennis court, and a building which contained a billiard room and bowling alley. Nelson loved sports and often umpired and played in community softball games. The kindergarten building was also used extensively for social events. The sliding walls could be opened to provide a location for lectures, dances, concerts, and theatrical productions. Nelson invited a variety of social thinkers to speak at Leclaire, including Jane Addams and Edward Everett Hale. By 1913, Leclaire had reached a population of about 700. There were 167 houses in the village, and 140 of them were occupied by their owners. In 1911, N.O. Nelson boasted that Leclaire was 21 years old and had never had a policeman, a boss, or a divorce. He also claimed there was no expensive city government, no city tax, no paupers, no jail, no vacant houses for rent, and no billboards or objectionable buildings. The multitude of children born in the community suggested the environment was good for raising kids.
Everybody was happy. Everybody was one large happy family. It was safe. You could run all around. We had our bicycles, the roads, the windy roads and everything. It was perfectly safe. There was the bandstand, there was the 4th of July fireworks, and all of which was furnished by the company.
I think it was a close community. I think everybody knew everybody and knew what was going on. If there was problems or anything like that, why, everybody knew about it and were willing to help. And most of them stayed where they were. We grew up in the same neighborhood for 20 years, I guess, 15, 20 years. Very stable.
I just have just enjoyed over the years Leclaire as home. But they were such nice people. I said we just felt family, like a family. That's the way we feel. I have thoroughly enjoyed it.
This has always been home to me. It seems that it was just yesterday. It was in the 20s that I lived in Leclaire, the village of Leclaire. And I think I would say my experiences here in the village of Leclaire, I used to set pins on the bowling alley right behind Leclaire park. I used to crawl under the big marble yards to get the baseballs that hit foul. I delivered the Intelligencer here in the village of Leclaire, and many, many, many things. I lived on Sherman Avenue, 803 if they haven't changed the address, and I really appreciate all the things that happened here in Leclaire. I swam this lake almost every day. Sometimes I thought I was going to drown, but I came out of it in pretty good shape.
We spent a lot of time at Leclaire Lake. I learned to swim there. I can remember when they had the rowboats on the lake that the young couples would rent, especially when they had their band concerts, and they would row out in the lake, which was quite scenic, I imagine, from where they were at. I never did get out there, but they were always rented at night when the band concert was. Everybody was out in the lake. They had a boat, and they would sit and listen to the music and whatever else came along, I guess.
I've always had good neighbors around here, and I got along good with each and every one of them. Never had a bit of trouble. I think it's one of the nicest neighborhoods, the cleanest neighborhood that you can live in, and the quietest. This is just as nice a place and nice a neighborhood to live as any of them, but even if I have to say that I'm the only old one that's living in this neighborhood.
Another thing that they did was we had the cooperative store, the grocery store, where they bought things practically at cost. Then we always went down to the Leclaire Pond, did our ice skating. Winters were much colder there than they are now. And we played ice hockey with a tin can.
Mm-hmm.
In the summertime, we'd go swimming there. So everything was just going fine. They were making money, and he was spending money, and as far as I know, everybody was happy. They had the grocery store, food was cheap, they had their gardens. He was an idealist. Worked out fine.
We governed our own self, and we just didn't do things to other people because, well, we didn't want them to do it to us, I suppose. I don't know. But we all got along just wonderfully well, but we did not have any police or anything. N.O. Nelson was great for providing things for the people of Leclaire that were healthy and happy and really worthwhile, you know. I think that I had the most wonderful childhood and the most wonderful growing up period that anybody could ever have. And all of us that, you know, lived out there and grew up, I suppose that we have a love for the man and for the village that is a little difficult to express. But life in Leclaire was just indescribable. It was wonderful.
The Nelson Company was doing extremely well too, and it expanded its operations into several other cities. The future of Leclaire was looking up, but there were events happening that would ultimately affect the entire community. After getting his model community established, Nelson had begun to widen the scope of his philanthropic spirit. He decided to take on a new project, one that pioneered another form of profit sharing. In 1912, he started a food distribution network in New Orleans. With its own plantation and dairy operation, the association could produce as well as distribute its food without paying a middleman. Gradually, this endeavor took up more of Nelson's energy, time, and funds. He began spending most of his time in New Orleans, overseeing the operations there, but he failed to understand how local associates were taking advantage of him. Theft, corruption, and graft drained the funds of the operation, requiring constant infusions of money from Nelson and ultimately from his company. When World War I began, the cost of all equipment and necessary items for food production increased dramatically, and the thin profit margin of the food co-op disappeared. Despite his enthusiasm for cooperation and profit sharing, Nelson was unable to overcome local prejudices and practices. The operation went bankrupt, even as he sought to pump even more of his money into the project. When banks started questioning the debts that Nelson was incurring, the N.O. Nelson Company managed to acquire a majority of stock, and Nelson was forced to relinquish control of the company. He left the organization with bitterness and disappointment.
He was getting older. I think he probably placed his trust in people who were not trustworthy. The upshot was that his storekeepers were literally robbing him blind. The outcome, of course, was that he went bankrupt. He was forced to sell his stock in the company, and it was picked up by other members of the company and the family. Then spent a period of time in California where he ultimately died.
Management of the company was turned over to Nelson's son-in-law, Louis Lonin. He had married Julia Nelson, youngest of the Nelson children. Lonin continued to make profits for the business, but many of the ideals set by its founder had been lost. The Nelson Company began specializing and eventually became one of the largest plumbing supply wholesalers in the United States. Unfortunately, in the 1950s, it was forced into a hostile takeover and its assets were drained by another company. The thriving enterprise was broken down into 95 separate wholesale businesses.
So when my father went in 1918 as head of the company, they sort of bought grandfather out. I mean, he had to set up money for his daughter and his wife, but he was a socialist.
Mm-hmm. Those are the days of the sweatshops and the working conditions of many people in this country were pretty bad, and his was certainly an example to be followed if anybody wanted to follow it, but I don't think very many people did.
The community of Leclaire, however, had long ago figured out how to live without its founder or the parent company. In 1934, it was annexed to the city of Edwardsville and lost its independent status. Although the cooperative aspects of the village were lost, the roots put down by those early residents have flourished. Despite the changes, the area has retained its unique characteristics. Many homes have changed considerably over the years, but others look pretty much the same. The park is still a community gathering place and a pleasant place to spend a summer afternoon. The factory buildings went through a series of hands, but eventually were purchased by Southern Illinois University to serve as its art studios. The buildings that once produced industrial products were then producing artwork instead. After the university built a new art building on campus, the factory complex became an extension of the Lewis and Clark College campus. In 1990, on the centennial year of the community's founding, there was a joyous celebration held to commemorate the event. School children paraded through the village, displaying signs with the principles on which the village was founded.
It gives my old heart great pleasure to see that the village survives after 100 years. It is wonderful to see so many of the elderly residents who have lived here for most of their lives, and also the younger people who have come here to raise their children because they found Leclaire to be, as we planned it, an ideal place to live. But let me congratulate you for your luck in growing up and living in this community and being the lucky one. Congratulations on this wonderful centennial celebration.
The accomplishments and the compassion of Nelson O. Nelson in establishing the community of Leclaire and to provide social endeavors to its residents and to its workers are such that all of us should be reminded in a stimulating way of his humanitarian ideals. May he long be remembered for his attempts to recognize such individuals and each individual as a person worthy of equal standing in his community regardless of his or her station in life.
I'd like to point out there was really 4 basic things that he guided his intuitions by. Number 1 was jobs, education, opportunity for recreation, and a chance to enjoy the nature as it is. And I feel that we have enjoyed that here in Leclaire, and I know that we will for many, many years to come. And thank you to Mr. Nelson.
Well, I think it's important to know where you've come from and where, perhaps based on that, where you're going in this world. And I think that we need these types of events to bring people out from behind their front doors and to meet and greet their neighbors.
It's fun to learn what people did back then and how they did it. History is important so you can compare what it's like now and what it was like then and what has improved.
Well, it's kind of important to know about the place where you live.
100 years ago was really the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and things are changing very quickly today, and we are in the computer age, and I think it's very important for not only the children but myself to realize where it all started and how we all begun this process of everlasting change.
And I think it's the cliche that we have to know who we were before we can begin to know who we are.
Well, to know your family is to know where you came from and your background, but it also gives you a lot of insight into the history of the whole world as you go back and back and back. And it's interesting to know that your family had something to do with it. And I think today people are doing more looking back into their family histories and where they came from and laughing and being able to, but they learn history. Because there's so much history now to learn, you can't learn it all, so you might as well focus in on something smaller.
Well, I am one of those individuals who very strongly feels that in this day and age that there has to be some element of continuity. Our children have to have a sense of belonging and realizing that things just didn't start at the day they became aware of things. That's one aspect of it. Another aspect of it is the idea of community pride. I think this is something that is important to keep a community alive and a community to progress if it has pride in itself. I suppose the same thing will happen with an individual. An individual having pride in himself will concern himself with his appearance and so forth. That pride is important, I think, also in keeping an area such as this from ultimately deteriorating. That pride is also important to ensure that the park is properly maintained. With that pride, there's also people taking interest. We don't have a tremendous crime problem as a result. You've got a lot of eyes here that look on to this. I think those are the kinds of things that are important in a community, and that people should recognize this. You know, sometimes we fall all over ourselves being so intrigued about political figures and what have you who may have come from Edwardsville, or any other community, when we actually had an experiment here, both a social experiment and an economic experiment, that was really quite unique.
In retrospect, we can look back on Leclaire's history and make several observations about its success. No matter what happened in the later years, Leclaire did achieve Nelson's main objective. His idealistic vision guided the community in its formative years, and very few residents regretted their decisions to live there. Some criticized the fact that no African Americans lived there, but it was not because they were prevented from doing so. There were no covenants or deed restrictions regarding race, as was common at the time. Nelson, in fact, had spent much of his life trying to help African Americans, and he provided schools, education, and housing assistance to black communities near his company's various plants around the country. There were, no doubt, some residents who rejected Nelson's values of simplicity and planned living. Despite these few dissatisfied people, there were certainly many residents who found Leclaire to be the perfect place to raise their families and establish a home. The generations of children who grew up here are testimony of the strength of Nelson's plan. In this regard, we can safely say that Nelson was successful. He achieved his goal of creating a prosperous community, one that still offers families today a place to settle down and enjoy the pleasures of life.
Perhaps the most fitting tribute that can be made about Leclaire is a poem written by farmer schoolteacher Mildred Shaw Briggs.
The village from whence I came is called Leclaire by name. A real fairyland it seemed to be, with winding streets and many a tree. One man's dream of a perfect village, people said. Well, 'tis true. Each man's home was his castle. Mother was queen with a child or two. We had a lake, we had a school, we had a store, we had church services too. Carefree children played in the sun. Oh, it was all such fun. We have all grown up since that fair day, and many have moved far away, but it's all still there, that beautiful, wonderful, dear little village we call Leclaire.